So I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Crown Speaker Series event, Life, Love, and Judaism, a conversation about writing and spirituality. I'm so glad that you've joined us. My name is Claire Suprin. I know many of you, although not everyone. And I serve as the Assistant Director of Jewish Studies at the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies here at Northwestern University. Tonight's event is part of a series of events. This is, I believe, our fourth or our fifth, sponsored by friends of Renee and Lester Crown in honor of their support of Jewish studies and Israel studies at the university. I want to tell you a word about the center. For those of you who don't know us, we are an active hub of scholarship and teaching with 17 affiliated faculty members from fields that range from history to religious studies to the study of literature in a range of languages. Together, the 17 of us teach more than 40 courses every year that enroll more than 700 students, and we offer both a major and a minor in Jewish studies. Tonight, we are very excited to welcome two authors for a panel discussion about Judaism and Jewishness and writing. By way of introduction, I think the simplest thing I can tell you is where this program began. And it began with the observation that there were a number of really exciting memoirs being published this year by Jewish women. And we wanted to recognize that, to take advantage of it. And so here we are tonight with two writers of two of those memoirs. Although, Abby, I have to tell you, your agent informed me very sternly that your book is not a memoir.
It is kind of a memoir.
It is kind of a memoir. The more of it I read, the more I decided it was okay to call it a memoir. We're going to talk tonight about the content of their individual books and also about the process and the experience of writing about one's religious life, especially as that religious life is expanding and contracting and changing. Our guests, as you likely know, are Tova Mervis and Abigail Pogrebin. I will introduce them individually in a moment and then moderate tonight's discussion. When we finish, we will have some time for questions from you, and then there will be books for sale in the lobby, and our authors have agreed to stay and sign books for a little while. Before any of that official program begins, I want to thank Nancy Gelman, our program administrator at the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. Together with Katie Genio, our program assistant, and our work studies students, really deserve that round of applause for overseeing the logistics of tonight's event. So, novelist Tova Mervis is the author of Visible City, The Outside World, and The Ladies' Auxiliary, which was a national bestseller. She's also a widely published essayist, and I'm sure that many of you, like me, read her essay about eating non-kosher pizza in the New York Times Sunday Style section just a few weeks ago. That essay was based on or drew from her most recent work, The Book of Separation, which chronicles her decision to stop being an Orthodox Jew, a decision that involves divorcing her husband and renegotiating her relationships with friends and family, as well as with the Mass Pike. For those of you who've never lived in Massachusetts, the Mass Pike is what we would call the highway. It's the major road that connects Boston with its suburbs and the rest of New England. And she joins us tonight from Newton, Massachusetts. Journalist Abigail Pogrebin is the author of the bestseller Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish, as well as One and the Same, a memoir about her experience growing up as an identical twin, and the Amazon Kindle single Showstopper, about her brief experience as a teenager on Broadway. Her recent book, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, began as a series of columns in the Forward newspaper, and it chronicles a year in which she researches and observes almost every Jewish holiday. Almost every Jewish holiday. There's always a few more you can discover. Along the way, during that year, Abby mourns the death of her father-in-law. She endures the good-spirited mocking of her parents' husband and children, and discovers new meaning in the Jewish life she was already living. She joins us tonight from Manhattan. Please join me in welcoming both Tova and Abby tonight. I've now officially shifted roles from introducer to moderator. I wanted to start by asking each of you, in whichever order you prefer, to talk about the circumstances that led to you deciding to write the books that you wrote and published this year.
Well, I really think of myself as a novelist. And one of the nice things about being a novelist is that you get to make things up. And there's always that sense that you pull from yourself, but it's not only yourself. You're inventing and changing. And right before my third novel came out, I had been writing an essay that I really thought I was writing mostly for myself. I was writing about my Orthodox Jewish get ceremony, in which I came to realize that I was really forging a separation, not just from a marriage, but from the world I was raised in. And I thought this is something I would never put out in public. This is just a private sort of way of understanding what happened. And I kept working on it, and for a variety of reasons, I ended up deciding I was willing to publish it. And I sent it to the New York Times, mostly thinking, what are the odds anyway? They would take it. It seemed like a safe bet. And about an hour later, I got an email saying they loved it and wanted to publish it. And I felt like writing back saying, I'm just kidding. I can't possibly do this. And I ended up, I didn't know when it was going to run, and I happened to be in Costa Rica on a hiking trip, where, I thought, well, the essay will come out once I get back. I won't think about it for these few days when I'm off the grid. And there was one spot where I could check my email, and if you held your phone at a certain angle, and I saw that the essay was going to be run the following day. And I think if I've learned one thing as a writer, it's that when you put your most private, painful story in the New York Times, a rainforest is a very good place to be. It was such a sense of exposure. And then I came home and I had hundreds of emails from people who had read the essay. And some were from family and friends, but really for the most part, they were from strangers, from men and women, old and young, from all religious backgrounds, who had read the essay and wanted to share their own stories with me of divorce, of religious transformation, really of change of one kind or another. And I think that experience made me realize that I had the stomach to write something this personal.
Can you all hear, or are these working? I would say, just the way Tova said, she wore the fiction writer's hat. I wore the journalist's hat for most of my career. And some of you may know I was 60 Minutes. I was a producer for Mike Wallace for 6 years. And before that for Charlie Rose, for the Charlie Rose Show, and Bill Moyers. So when I switched to print, which was really because I had kids and wanted to see them and not always be on planes, I started writing for magazines and eventually wrote Stars of David, which was, I think, a very backdoor way of reckoning with my own Jewish identity. And I did it in not maybe the most intuitive way, which was to sit down with famous Jews. I think some of our highest achievers, whether it be Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Steven Spielberg or Natalie Portman or Mark Spitz, and say, does this matter to you? Does this still matter to you? Whatever you were raised with, Jewish education or rituals, have you held on to them? Have you passed them on to your children? Realizing that I hadn't really asked those journalist questions of myself. And so Stars of David took me on a Jewish path I didn't expect journalistically that ended up being really the focus for me of what interested me the most and challenged me the most. And the deeper you get into kind of Jewish learning in the Jewish world, the more you realize, contrary to Tova, who grew up with all this stuff, I had sort of the tent poles of a Jewish life, but not really the infrastructure of a Jewish life, and I wanted to understand it. Both, I would say, as a Jewish journalist, but also as a Jew myself, and a mother, and a friend, and as someone who I think wanted to not just accept something that I've inherited, but unpack it in a way that I hadn't before. And for me, at least, the holidays are essentially the architecture of a Jewish life. And I think some of us who observe maybe 5 of them, we know what our Seders are like. We know what our Yom Kippur fast is like if we fast. But what is Shmini Atzeret in 2014-15 when I did this? Why should it matter? Should we fast 6 times? What does it mean to fast for a temple that no longer is animated for us? I wanted to kind of go against the Pew study, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which said that basically Jews are abandoning religion, even though they still feel identified as Jews. I kind of wanted to flip that and say maybe that's because we haven't really explored what that tradition asks of us, not so much in a way of an orthodox life, but frankly in not just an intellectual but an emotional one, seeing whether our calendar can speak to us in 2017.
So I want to pick up on something that both of you mentioned, which is the different ways that you approached your books as a journalist, as a novelist. For those of you who've read both, one of the things you may also have noticed is that everybody in Tova's book has a made-up name. So if you don't know them personally, which I don't, you can't go and Google them or read any of their writings or find a photograph of them. Everybody in Abby's book is a real person with a real name, and you can look them up and learn more about them. I'm curious about the writing process and how you structured the book and how you think that your background with particular types of writing affected that. Either order.
Well, I feel like I started as a fiction writer, and the strange thing about it was there were many times I thought, oh, if only I could change that, or wouldn't it be great if I could just fix the ending? And of course, in writing memoir, you're not allowed to do that all of a sudden, where you stick to the facts. But I was also aware, for the first time, of what it meant to really write about real people. In novels, people's opinions notwithstanding, you're not really writing about real people, or you're pulling, but that sense that these were my children, these were my parents, these were my family members. And so I was very aware, I think, in a way that I never had been in writing, of the tremendous power and responsibility of the written word, and I felt that I wanted to, on one hand, change names, just to have some semblance of privacy. Of course, anyone who knew me knew these are her kids, and these are her parents, this is where they live, but some sense that you could create a layer of protection. I also, I think in writing it, it's interesting in reading Abby's book, I was struck by how we both sort of follow the Jewish year. My book also begins on Rosh Hashanah, and it was interesting to think about how the holidays, even in a book about ostensibly leaving, still follows that cycle. That the cycle is so built in and so ingrained as part of who I am. And so I thought about, structure, I think for me was really important, that question of how do you tell a personal story where, of course, if I wrote down every single thing that happened, it would be like my memoir in 5 volumes, thousands of pages. And so there's always a process of choosing what to put in and what to take out. And I guess I approached it as I do a novelist, to think about not just sort of the endless thinking and rumination that goes on inside everyone's heads, but what happened? What are the actions? How does this year sort of shape, what is the shape of it and what is the arc? And to really try to bring my novelist sensibility to it, to create a sense of characters and movement and theme and plot in that way.
I would echo that and say, I think part of my background as a producer was when you do something for 60 minutes, you take a story that is very often complicated and you have to boil it down to a 12-minute segment. And one of the things when you're in the editing room is not just is this clear and am I telling a good story, but am I bored? And I'm very aware of boredom, not just as a journalist, but as a consumer of stories. And when is something actually kind of like, you're just giving me so much information that I actually want to take a nap, or is it something that you are making me think about something that makes me look at my own life? And the way I approached, I think, the research for this was, I kind of have become a rabbi groupie since Stars of David was published in 2005. You just go to all these conferences and you kind of pick out the people that are like, that person's amazing. Or I can't believe how interesting that person's take is on either Torah or that verse or that particular prayer or that particular ritual. So I hope and intended to sort of curate for the reader some of the people I think in the country who are the best teachers. So there's over 60 rabbis and scholars in the book. And I wanted someone to pick up this volume and not see it as medicine, not see it as some kind of slog, but a very lively narrative and story where hopefully also not only learning something, but you're saying, does this reflect in my own life? Whether, frankly, someone is Jewish or not, but particularly if someone has a Jewish story themselves, and every Jew has a pretty good story.
One of the choices that you make is to let a lot of these rabbis speak in their own words. In between chapters, there are pages with writing directly from some of the rabbis that you talk with. Why did you do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, I have a great degree of humility in writing this, which is that I am not the expert. I am not the one who's been ordained. I'm kind of the traveler, and I wanted to give. So not only are they quoted quite a bit in the book, but I wanted to have a breath between sort of the Abby narrative to just have what I would consider kind of a gem of a drash, a small Devar Torah about each holiday, so you have a breath and a break, but you also have kind of a moment that I think is fairly magical, where it just stands alone. It was also to honor the fact that these are maybe not experts, that's too facile, but these are the people who not just live and teach us every day, but I think the task of our rabbis and scholars is to take an ancient thing and reanimate it over and over again. And I wanted to honor that by giving them kind of single moments to do that without my voice at all.
Did anyone say no?
No, no one said no, which is a very big thing for Jews. Because I would say when I was doing Stars with David, I had a lot of celebrities say no. And actually, they're not a lot, and I remember every one of them took every rejection personally, which is very Jewish. So I lost, Barbara Streisand. Everyone's like, how could you write a book without Barbara Streisand? I just want to wear on a t-shirt, Barbara Streisand said no. She's not in my book. And I didn't get Seinfeld either. So that's my Jewish failure. For this, pretty much across denominational spectrum, from the most ultra-Orthodox to, renewal Judaism, people said yes. And I think that really speaks volumes. We were not in the territory which could fracture us like Middle East policy. These were people who were saying, Abby, I know you're kind of late to the party, relatively, but pull up a chair. Let's talk. Let's talk about this.
Thank you. And Tova, I have to tell you, when you were talking about structuring the memoir, one of my favorite moments in the book is you talk about the diamond falling out of your engagement ring. And you comment, if I were writing a novel and I used this as a technique to symbolize what was happening with my marriage, I would write too obvious. Did it really happen?
It did. I mean, I would never make up something like that because it seems like such an obvious thing to lie about it. Right as my marriage was coming apart, I looked down at my engagement ring and the diamond was missing. And in a novel, if someone had written that detail, I would have been like, oh, come on, like, what's symbolism? Oh, I wonder what this is supposed to stand for. And the strangest about writing from life is that life sometimes hands us these moments that are harder to believe and yet perfect in a certain way that do symbolize that. And I thought a lot about those moments. What are those moments that mean something at the time they happen, and then later in reflecting on them. But every time I think about someone reading that, I always think, oh, they're going to think I'm lying. But I'm not. I'm really not.
I knew you weren't lying when you said that your daughter picked it up and said, oh, Mommy, is this the bead you're looking for?
I think she wanted to keep it.
Fair enough. And that also, the whole comment on engagement rings and all of that. We'll keep that for another conversation. But speaking of children, one of the things I enjoyed so much in both books was the presence of your families and multiple generations. We met siblings, we also met parents and children. And Abby, you write about how your mom's feminism meant that she exposed you to only a small slice of organized Jewish life, but that organized Jewish life included feminist seders, which for most Jews were not part of their exposure. You also write about the Jewish experiences you've been able to give your children and the realization that they might be too old to be exposed in the way that young children can be exposed to so much more. Tova, my mom is sitting in the audience, but when your mom keeps worrying that if you don't keep Shabbat but your husband does, it will be confusing for the children, I heard that in my own mother's voice, things that are confusing for children. And yet, in your portrayal of your own children, there's such compassion for the way you see them negotiating between your home and their father's home. So I was hoping each of you could talk a little bit more about what your journey has been like for you as a member of a family and all of those relationships.
For some, I'm just going to hold this because my voice is sort of... My mom, some of you may know, is a co-founder of Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem, started in 1973, I think. So, and she was a very observant Jew growing up in Queens, the shtetl of Queens, and left observant Jewish life when she was 15 because she had a very painful experience. Her mother died of cancer when my mother was 15. And despite all of my mother's education and facility, frankly, with liturgy, she was prohibited from saying mourner's Kaddish. because she was female, solely because she was a girl. And so the fact that they went literally out to get a 10th man was so painful for her that she turned her back on organized kind of formal religion, although we always went to the high holidays somewhere, and we had 2 seders. And she came back to it very strongly through an egalitarian lens, but also more traditional than people realize. But in the middle of all this, she co-created this feminist Seder, which has lived on and had many iterations since, but it was groundbreaking at the time. And you can imagine, a whole bunch of women sitting on the floor, including Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug, if I hope some people remember her, with her big hat. And they took the Haggadah and basically brought women back to the story. There are so many women in the Exodus story, whether it's Shiphrah and Puah or Miriam, and honored them, but also acknowledged kind of modern plagues and things that were kind of a little crunchy at the time, but now I think many people have found. But in doing this book, I wanted to make sure that even though I was raised with this feminist lens, I was also very open to every iteration of Judaism, and some obviously very traditional, where there's a mechitza and women are separate. And that was a struggle. I'm honest about the times where I came up against some discomfort there. But it's important for me to both honor and feel very obviously enriched by my mother's own journey, but also finding my own and approaching this book without prejudice as much as I could. For my own kids, and I have a son at Northwestern, yay, very proud of that, but he wasn't there when I began this. They've been raised with someone who is kind of in their mode of discovery, and sometimes that can be annoying for teenagers. I am lucky enough that I have 2 kids who are kind of, rooting for me and also seeing what I was bringing home, which hopefully is reflected in the book, which is that I am evangelical about the fact that I think a lot of Jewish learning has been deadened. And, when I was doing Stars of David, so many of these famous people said they were traumatized by Hebrew school. And I thought, something we can't blame, a generation of people who were turned off by this, but something went wrong in the sense that a lot of people were either bored by it or felt like it was this dusty thing on a shelf that didn't speak to them. And I have found that there is resonance and relevance that I hope that I'm passing on to my kids, but I need them to be part of it. It's not just my coming home and teaching them things. So that's hopefully reflected in the book as well. And my husband, who is from Evanston, I know I have a lot of Chicago roots, despite being a New Yorker, was kind of like, did my wife, become a shugana, but is extremely, I think, grateful for the fact that we have found something together that we didn't know when we were married.
I think so much about that question of how we become and what that does to the people around us. And I think if you leave something or become part of something before you have children, if I had left the Orthodox Jewish world in my early 20s before I had children, it would have been complicated, but not as complicated. And part of being a parent is that we take our children along with us on our journeys, in whichever direction, even as we acknowledge they have their own journeys. And in writing this book, one of the things I thought a lot about was, and in living, of course, the book, thought a lot about was, how does my change affect my children, my parents, and how do you both leave something, as much as it's a book of separation, I think it's also a book of staying, and how do we remain connected to those who view things differently? How do we still place that sense of family and love at the forefront and not let it be torn apart by differing ideologies? So when I think about my children, I think about being a young mother with 3 young children, where I thought the hardest part was sort of holding on, was figuring out how to manage sort of the chaos of life with small children. And now, as a parent of an 18-year-old, I realized that wasn't the hard part at all. The hardest part is letting go. It's the opposite. It's wrestling with the fact that our children are their own people, and we teach them, and we instill things in them, and we shape them, and we have hopes for them, and we have a vision for them, but ultimately they become themselves. And it's a painful lesson sometimes. It's not always so simple, that idea. And I think about it both as a mother and a daughter. And one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book was my own immediate family, where my older brother is part of a Breslover ultra-Orthodox community in Sfat in Israel. My younger sister is modern Orthodox, and then there's me. And my middle son, who is a big sports fan, I was sort of explaining this to him, and he thinks of everything in sports terms. And he calls my parents Nana and Gaga. And so he says, I guess Nana and Gaga must feel like they're 1 for 3. You know, only one of the kids is like them. And I told my parents this story, and they said, no, we're 3 for 3. And I think the challenge of parenting really is that you teach your children, but also you make room for the fact that they might think something else. And you know, you mentioned my pizza essay. You know, a piece of the book was in the New York Times, and it was a very nerve-wracking piece to put out because it was an essay about my middle son. You know, he's called Josh in the book. It's very strange to use the fake names, but he, for many years, was sort of chafing at the Orthodox world we lived in. He was sort of the one who was always sort of rebelling, didn't want to wear a yarmulke, but sort of had his own sort of journey within it, even at a young age. And I was initially very cagey with the kids about the fact that I was no longer Orthodox as I had once been. And he asked me if I would take him for if I had ever eaten non-kosher pizza. I thought, oh, do I tell him the truth? Do I, you know, is this a moment where you bring your full self as a parent? Or do you sort of say what they're supposed to hear? Or can you speak authentically about who you actually are? How much do we share with our children of our own true lives? And after much hemming and hawing on my part and wrestling, I eventually did take him, but I told him that we could only eat vegetarian pizza. I'm a vegetarian, it was very important to me. And he accepted that, but I sort of saw him eyeing all the different options in this pizza store. And he turned to me and said, you know, if one day when I'm older, I decide to eat pizza with meat on it, will you still love me? Oh, wow. And I just thought, that's the question, right? I mean, that is the question. When we change, or when, you know, we don't get to decide how everyone will change, do we still have that possibility for love and connection? And can we connect across these ideological lines in so many ways in our world where everything seems to be ideological and complicated? And so I think, you know, in writing about my family, I think those were really the questions I most wanted to explore, that sense of separating and yet connecting.
So, you know, when you write questions for a moment like this, you write them in a vacuum. And so thank you for creating the conversation that I was imagining. So one of the things I was thinking about in preparing was the degree to which Judaism is often described, and I think often lived, as a religion of action rather than belief. It's not to say that there aren't certain things that Jews are supposed to believe. And I'll tell you, this is a little bit of an aside, but our 3-year-old has developed we don't know where it came from, a very funny habit. My husband will sing the Shema with the 2 boys before bed every night, and he sings it in Hebrew, and he's started singing it in English. Of course, it ends with "The Lord is one." And Ethan, even before now he finishes the Shema, the 3-year-old will yell out, "No, the Lord is 2!" And he's recognized that it drives us crazy, which is why he continues doing it. And I listen every night, and I think to myself, well, does it really matter that he's saying this? Doesn't it matter more that he's hearing the Shema every night? And it gets back to, in some ways, this question. I'm a scholar, I can't help it. This question, you know, are we about what we do or what we believe? And I think most often, especially in contrast with Christianity, we define ourselves by what we do as Jews. So, you know, we try to figure out who's in the community, who's not in the community. We ask, you know, well, who keeps kosher and who doesn't? Who goes to synagogue on Shabbat and who doesn't? Who drives there? Who walks there? Who goes once a month? Who goes every week? Who sends their kids to religious school? Who sends their kids to day school? Who hires a private tutor for their children to have one-on-one instruction in addition to religious school, in place of, you know, it goes on, and we have all these ways of watching what we do, what others do, and we rarely stop to ask exactly who believes what. But in both of your books, we get a glimpse into the internal and the conversations about what we believe, what we don't believe. There's a moment, Tova, in your book where you describe sitting in your Orthodox synagogue and really struggling with your own relationship to what's going on and just wondering, are there others here who are struggling as I'm struggling? Does everybody here believe or not believe? And it's coupled, of course, with this description of your hat being too tight. And so the physical experience of Judaism is tied in there as well. And Abby, in your book, there are these, in some ways, very short passages from time to time where you talk about praying and how deeply you mean your prayers and you intend them, but also at the same time you question them. Am I asking for too much? Could we have good health and all of these other things all at the same time? And I'm curious both about what it was like to write in that deeply personal way, and then also what is it like to know people have read those internal thoughts, which we so infrequently actually talk about in real life. So it's a two-part question, and it's a difficult one probably. I'll let you answer it in the way you want.
I mean, I think you've hit on what's probably the hardest part of it for me, which is that it feels somewhat indulgent to talk about one's own faith and one's own struggle with prayer, which I would just admit that I do struggle with it. I think that Judaism is a demanding tradition. There's just no question about it. And people have found their own ways. I'm sure everyone in this room could describe whatever faith you are, whether you've chosen it, rejected it, or charted a path. But when it comes to liturgy, prayer, and what these words are on a page that obviously were written a long time ago, I personally am someone where if I don't understand it, or if it's somehow not intellectually making sense to me, then it's very hard spiritually for it to open something for me. And I had many rabbis say to me as I was doing this book, sometimes it's not going to be a cognitive experience. Sometimes you do, and then something happens. And that Sinai, line of "you will do, we will do, and we will hear," is I think important as a way in that I hadn't quite experienced before. Is that there are many things you are supposed to do. And reading Tova's book and knowing that she was in a car when she knew she was normally supposed to be, on Erev Rosh Hashanah in a synagogue, and just how jarring that was. There are places you're supposed to be and things you're supposed to be doing at a certain time. To me, there was something very powerful about the unanimity of showing up together, but also it was sometimes hard to say, am I feeling what I should be feeling at this moment? And can I talk about the disappointment sometimes when I didn't, sort of like the chorus line, song, and I felt nothing. There was so much preparation for Yom Kippur. There was so much front loading of atonement and introspection and heshbon nefesh, which is accounting of the soul, that I really felt ready, and yet kind of was waiting for lightning to strike, and it didn't. But also was aware that sometimes I was feeling things and not, almost like it had passed me by without realizing how intense those moments had been. And I'm sure, I hope that you all relate to that too, where sometimes it does feel, at least for me, that God was in the room, and you sometimes didn't notice it until much later. So both things were happening to me, and I really tried, and also had an editor who pushed to say, I feel like you're not being honest enough here. Go back and go back to that moment and tell us a little bit more truthfully what was happening for you.
Did you keep notes as you were going, or was it all?
Well, sometimes you can't write, obviously, especially in Orthodox settings. I'm pretty anal about mental notes, but I also found that there was sensory memory, where sometimes I would listen to a song, or kind of go back to the food, or something that was happening that triggered it for me, or a text, because often it was, Tova talked about how the diamond happened, meets you where whatever you're feeling somehow. The narrative unfolds itself. And that, I was losing my father-in-law during Hanukkah when I was writing this. I never expected that the menorah would suddenly take on a different meaning in terms of light, or the diminishing of light when I was experiencing that loss. And that's, again, something, if you put it in a movie, it would seem really, really treacly and saccharine. But when those things hit you and you're paying attention, it writes it down for you.
I think that the tension you describe between belief and belonging really runs through the center of my book, and my question, I guess, about my relationship to the Orthodox world. And I think for a long time I was very aware that I could be Orthodox as long as I observed. So if I dressed the way I was supposed to, or if I kept my kitchen the way I had always had, it almost felt like it didn't matter what I actually believed. And I know that there's sort of this tension in the Orthodox world about belief versus belonging, and the placement of actions at the forefront. Yet, I think belief matters. I think it matters what we actually believe. And so that my experience became one of inauthenticity, because I eventually, as the years went on, that gap widened between belief and belonging. And I became aware that I was doing things because I wanted to fit in, because I was part of a community, because I was in a marriage and a family, and that was just what we did. But was aware that the underpinning, that sense of foundational belief, was very weak. And I think to know that was a very threatening feeling, because everything, of course, is presumably stacked upon belief. And if that goes, then what happens to all those actions? And I think in writing about that, that is the place that felt most exposing, to really ask myself that question that for years and years I shied away from. It was sort of a back of the mind, don't think about this moment. But I can be observing, in the book I wrote, one of the things I wrote was at the mikvah, where the ritual bath, where everything is about observance, about minute rules that are not just a kitchen counter or not just observing a holiday, but are written on the most intimate parts of your body. And that question there of saying, but do I believe? Do I believe in it? And I think the book really charts that willingness to engage with that question and to answer what happens when the answer was not what I thought it would be, what I once imagined it would be. And I think the sense of writing about it, that, I also had an editor who would, again and again pushed, can you be more honest? Because, of course, memoir is tremendously exposing. And I think about my second novel, The Outside World. I wrote about a man who described himself as an observant agnostic. And he described standing in Sheol, feeling that he is the only one who feels this way. Because it's certainly in a room where there's a presumption of something, a presumption of belief, or a sameness of practice, to feel quietly, I don't believe this, and everyone around me presumably does. I think that has to be one of the most lonely feelings there are. And it was one thing to write about it in fiction. When all of a sudden, in writing memoir, that same question gets asked of yourself, it is exposing. And, I always feel that sense of the strangeness of it for me as a writer. But I also feel, I think what moves me as a writer is that urge for honesty, that sense of, can you talk about this? Can you say not what you're thinking, but what you're really thinking? And, I feel like I write in the hope and in the spirit that there's an interest in a willingness to have those conversations that make us uncomfortable, even make me very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to know a little bit more about your lives now, because your memoirs both cover a period of several years ago. I know, Abby, you were 2014 or 20?
2014, 15, and then I kind of revisited it 15, 16.
Okay, and Tova, what year?
2012, I believe.
So 2012. So not that much time has passed, but enough that I wonder what your spiritual life looks like now. Abby, I loved when I got to the end of the book and you have a short epilogue where you ask, well, has it changed me? And it's yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, with a reason, an explanation for each yes and each no. So if you could talk a little bit about the yeses and the nos. And Tova, one of the interesting things in your memoir, and some of my friends who also read it have remarked on this to me, is that I think for some readers there's an expectation that if you leave Orthodoxy, you'll go to a more liberal form of Judaism, and at least within the book, that doesn't seem to be what you want. It seems very black and white. And so I'm curious if you would say that you have a Jewish community right now, or what your spiritual life looks like. So.
Well, it's interesting, the idea of, life continues after the memoir and what happens in those ensuing years. And, I think the idea of writing a book about leaving, I think there's a state of unbecoming that I always feel like when you write about leaving something that you have to sort of honor, that you don't go from one thing to the next. Soon after I started telling people that I was no longer part of the Orthodox community, someone said, well, are you conservative? Are you Reform? What are you? And I was like, what does that even mean to decide I'm going to uncheck that box and check this box instead? I don't think our spiritual lives or our emotional lives work like that. And I always think of this sort of desert space between places, this sense that you move slowly over years from one to another. And the state of no longer being something, I think, is a very powerful place to be for a time period. And it's interesting you say that. One of the things I think a lot about there's several books about leaving ultra-Orthodoxy, where the journey charted is sort of a wider journey. It's from being part of a community that is fully insular to leaving it entirely. And I don't feel like that's what my book charts really. When I was writing it, I was sort of piecing out the chapters and the sections, and part 3, which is supposedly the she's left, the first line of it is my daughter wanting to make hamantashen. And I was like, oh God, does this count as a book about leaving if, by page 250 we're like in the kitchen making hamantaschen still? And I was like, no, but that is a kind of leaving, because not every leaving has to be entire or absolute. And I understand the urge to leave fully. I think that leaving creates scars, and when you leave something, there's that sense of rupture. And any kind of return to it, you carry that sense of scar with you. And so I think for me, that sense of still being very much part of the Jewish community, and particularly the Boston Jewish community, which I love very much, and having my kids in pluralist Jewish day schools there, it in some ways, it forces that question into a more active space. When I was sort of trying to be the person I was supposed to be and remain in something that didn't feel alive or meaningful, but was sort of continuing because I was supposed to, there's sort of an automaticness to it and a roteness to it. Leaving requires you to actually do the work of deciding, how do I want to engage? And so reading Abby's book was so interesting. I was like, oh, I love this stuff. This is so interesting. This sense of, can you re-engage? Can you leave and recognize, I think, the change, and yet decide where you want to engage and be a part of it? And so I would probably place myself in that state of, it doesn't look the same as it always did. It doesn't look like, there's not that same sense of obligation, which for me was a very large part of my observance. It wasn't what is meaningful, let me do it. It was, I have to do this, so how can I make myself want to do it? Now it really comes at it from a different angle of, where do I connect? What is meaningful to me? What do I want to pass on to my children? What do I want to, for myself, how do I want to celebrate holidays so that there is that sense of authentic connection, authentic meaning to them?
That's great. And I think what Tova raises is this idea of choice, and whether we inherit something or feel burdened by what we have been given or is expected of us, and then what we come to on our own. And, right now, it's a little bit complicated where I am because I happen to be president of my synagogue, which is just this other role that I somehow landed in very unexpectedly from, where I started. But it's a Reform synagogue. It's Central Synagogue. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a historic synagogue with 2,300 families, very wonderful and demanding New Yorkers. And and I have 6 months left of a 3-year term. It's been incredibly meaningful. But it makes you see day to day what Judaism in its kind of structure can give someone who is at the hardest time of their lives. Something I just hadn't seen up close before, but I know in my role, which is this person is suddenly had a terrible diagnosis, and that person just lost a child, and this person is having a gay marriage, and this person is freaking out that their child might marry a non-Jew. And, when you see that kind of high relief every day, it sort of changes what I went through in my kind of Jewish exploration, and almost makes it not moot, but I kind of wish we were having a dialogue that could absorb all of it, including, reading Tova's book and realizing that when she talks about belief, I was so with her that I thought, what does anything I've discovered mean if you can get to a point where when you grew up with all of it, it suddenly, in a way, loses, it becomes something that isn't as animated as I have discovered it to be. And is that naive of me, in a sense, to have discovered something late and found the animation in it? So struggling with those things and trying to be honest as I could in the epilogue, which I hope you will be intrigued enough to pick up, is that I don't want to say, and it's a perfect ending with a bow on it, and I've become this kind of Jew, because I didn't really call myself a strong Reform Jew until I found Central Synagogue and fell in love with it, and now I'm the president, so I wear this, like I am from the Reform movement, but for me, the silos and the labels are actually not helpful, particularly, and not really accurate, because I bet each person in this room, has parsed their Judaism or their religion very differently. And so I guess I'm saying I live in the complexity, and it's part, for me, of what makes it so interesting. It's what I fell in love with. I fell in love with a conversation that is thousands of years old, that I do think has endured because it's complex, because it's not simple, because you have people like Tova still wrestling with it, and sometimes, yes, leaving it, but also not abandoning it. And the honesty around that, to me, is sometimes what's missing, and it's where I continue to live.
Okay, so I want to Thank you both. And I'd like to open up open up the conversation. We have time for some questions from all of you. Nancy here has a microphone with these very long rows, and I don't want the people in the middle to feel they can't ask questions, so we'll just pass the microphones along as needed. So over here, we'll start right in the middle.
Thank you both. It's fascinating. I've read all three of your books, and I'm starting your separation book, and I think what I got from the very beginning of the book is understanding the first three books, how outsiders are such a change in, I will use threat, and also a impetus to do change for good things. So I wonder if you might want to comment on that.
It's interesting when I think about how I've always had this fascination with outsiders, and sometimes I attribute it to my southern upbringing. I grew up in Memphis, and there was always that sense of, strict community of who's in and who's out. And I think, I'm going to paraphrase Flannery O'Connor, who said, someone asked her, why do Southerners always write about freaks, is the term she uses, and she says, we're the only ones who can still recognize that. That when you have a carefully ordered world, that's when you can have an outsider or an insider. And that, that has been a fascination for me. And I think one of the ways I'm interested in the theme of the outsiderness is because someone trying to come into a world is what sheds the most light on what that world looks like inside. And so my first novel, The Ladies' Auxiliary, was really about a woman who converts and wants this world, and she wants to be part of the Orthodox Jewish community in Memphis, and yet she's not like everyone. She doesn't know their social norms or their social codes. And I guess it really does follow, that theme has followed me. And maybe when I think about my memoir in light of those books, I think that outsiderness is not just a biographical state where we can identify the person who's outside, but a lot of times it's an emotional, internal state as well, where even those who we might look at as the insiders, even those who ostensibly, outwardly belong, feel privately that they don't. Maybe that was my experience, this sense of, you would never know. With my hat on, I would hide underneath it. You wouldn't know. But we privately feel ourselves, I think, sometimes to have those questions of, do we actually fit in?
Thank you.
As you mentioned, the religion or tradition is pretty patriarchal, so I kind of wanted to ask you how you cope with it or handle it.
Why don't you take that?
Yeah, I'll start. I think for me, I wanted to, again, walk into an Orthodox space and not judge the mechitza, the divider. But I also don't think we can be naive about the fact that has affected people's experience, women's experience of worship, sometimes men's experience of worship. And at the same time, I went to an Orthodox synagogue where they have worked very hard to kind of minimize the separation, a Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, where the bima is in the middle and the mechitza is low and they're equal sides. And then went to Carlbach Shul in New York, which is this famous shul, known for its amazing music, but literally the men were having like this ecstatic experience on one side, joyful and, like this incredible festival going on, and the women were at a funeral. I mean, that's what it felt like. It was, and we were in the same space and separated by 2 inches. And I can't lie and say that was easy for me. I kind of wanted to be over there. And I had entered with a friend whom I couldn't sit with. So I think just, obviously I'm not saying anything that hasn't been wrestled with, but I sometimes think we are still missing the honesty of the conversation of what it means for someone to walk into a space where it is actually not an equal worship experience.
I think you end up in a lot of spaces in the book where you are new and you're not familiar, and you experience that newness in different ways, and it comes through differently in the Carlbach scene than in the others. So thank you.
I have a question related to the Hebrew school phenomenon that you talked about. I hear many people talk about their upbringing in Hebrew school and what a turnoff it was, and trying to get them back, and whether they went from conservative to reform to try that, and then their offspring and how they experienced it as a continuing challenge for families.
Yeah, and obviously, I don't want to speak for Central, which I think is, doing it fairly well. I think the challenge, at least what I have seen, and I've obviously been a parent as well as a writer through this, is that the default is sometimes to dumb it down to keep the kids interested, which I think is actually the complete wrong direction. That I think if you take something like the, Akedah, which is the, sacrificing of Isaac, okay, maybe a 6-year-old could be traumatized by that story, but fairly, a 10-year-old can engage that story, and in a way that I think is done sometimes so simplistically that it's not that interesting. So my feeling or my soapbox is, if you take something like the Seder, which I write about in the book, it shouldn't just be the 4 questions where the kids kind of sit up and say, it's my turn. They should be involved through that entire service, the reading of the Haggadah in every way. It's the mitzvah is to keep the kids interested, and that's not bells and whistles and just asking why is there an egg or a karpas on the plate. It's got to be more than that, and I think it can be. And I don't think that actually takes as much ingenuity as I find some people are constantly saying to me, well, what do you do with your kids that makes them pay attention and not just want to get to the matzo ball soup? I have a lot of those things in the book, and they're not gimmicks. It's going to what the text offers, and I think sometimes we miss that. I also just think it's been so frontal, learning, and that kids often, especially now, that's not how they're learning anymore. And we haven't really adapted, I think, in Jewish education necessarily to this new world where kids think differently, absorb differently. And I just, again, believe we haven't been as innovative as we might be. And then finally, it's that you want to say, give it one more chance. Because I think if we're honest about it, when my kids were bar and bat mitzvah, we had to go to 1 million of these services. And I would walk out of most of them and say, why would any of these kids come back? Really, this has been, talk about medicine, talk about a slog, talk about being on your phone surreptitiously. I don't blame you. This is just endless and uninteresting. And no, I don't think we should have a drum circle to make these kids sit up and pay attention. But there are these moments where you've got a kid as a captive audience. Can you not make this tradition come alive for them, that they maybe say, that was kind of great. I'd come back for that.
I once had a friend, a fellow writer, who told me that he made sure to send his kids to Hebrew school because he wanted to inoculate them against ever becoming too involved in Judaism. What a statement that is. But I agree with what you're saying, but I just wanted to add that also, I think the question of genuine engagement on the part of parents or teachers, that sense that kids, I think, learn from what we are passionate about or what we genuinely care about, and I think are very sensitive to where something is being compelled of them or required of them or being told what you must think about something, as opposed to having that open-ended sense of question. And I think about my own children, where they're most engaged is where they are not being told this is who you must be, what you must think, but that question is being asked. Who are you? What do you think? Where can you find points of engagement? And where we're open to all answers, not just to the answer we wish to hear about engagement, but to lots of possibilities of how they're experiencing it as well.
I would just add to that, I interviewed Jason Alexander for my first book from Seinfeld, and yes, I did not get Seinfeld, but I got Jason. And he said his parents used to insist he go to Hebrew school against his will because, this was a quote, there are people in this world who would kill you just because you're a Jew, and you have to know what you're dying for. That kind of tells you.
I have to stop laughing. Other questions?
Yeah, thank you both. Really very interesting, because a lot of us here are wrestling with the same things you have wrestled with. About a week ago at the Oneg at our synagogue, I saw a woman that hadn't been at the service, and I said, oh, welcome. And she said, I don't normally come. I just stopped in because I don't believe in God. And she just told me she didn't believe in God. She didn't feel like she belonged there. So my question is, and I thought I helped her with it a little bit, but I'd like to hear from both of you, because you're talking about belief and belonging. And so if you could talk about what you would say to someone who said that to you, I don't believe in God, so I'm not sure I belong here. I told her no one here believed in God either. That kind of God.
Well, I think part of what's so interesting is, can you say that? I think there are lots of places where that might be thought, or I don't know if I believe in God, or I don't believe in the kind of God that we are talking about here, or my notion of God is more complicated. I think for me, my sense of what is hardest is when that's sort of like the open secret that no one can talk about, that it's or even doubt, even with people who do believe, to acknowledge that there's doubt and question. And I think the way it becomes alienating is when that statement or question is taboo. And I used to have this fantasy, I was going to have everyone put their heads down in the middle of shul and do, okay, I won't tell anyone, just a quick show of hands. Who actually really, really believes that sense of when can you talk about it and when are you allowed to say it? And I think just even her being able to say that to you and you being able to respond opens up the possibility of engagement in a wider variety of saying, because I think for me, my experience was the pretend, the game of pretending to think and yet not thinking. But if you can say, I don't know that I believe in a sense of command or religious obligation or a God who watches my kitchen, but I connect to the idea of Jewish history, or I connect to Jewish culture, or I want to be at this Seder because I connect to this story, that I'm part of this story. When you enable people to have that honest conversation, I think is when you pull in so many more people without that sense of, I'm here, but I think what you're describing is her feeling of, I don't really belong, I'm pretending. And I think that pretense is what we need to do away with, because that is what keeps people out the most, I think.
And I would completely agree in that honesty is so much of what's missing here, partly because people feel like it's not even on the table. But I would also say many of the people I spoke to talk about how absent God is from the Bima often. And for those who travel and listen to sermons, as I do a lot, it's surprisingly not in the conversation for Jews very often. And I was just on a panel with David Gregory. I don't know if you've been with him yet on the circuit, but he wrote a book about finding God, finding faith. And I was listening to him almost like, God, you sound like a born-again Christian, And he acknowledged that people have reacted that way. Jews have reacted that way to his book. It's like, we don't talk this way. Jews don't talk this way. We don't talk about God that way. We don't talk about God protecting us, finding the Lord. I mean, there are words he's using that honestly I almost never hear in sort of New York, even more observant life. And so I think even just, obviously that's a sort of high-level conversation to have with this person, but giving her permission to say, you're not alone, and even the idea of can you be a Jew without faith is something that I think is a fascinating and important conversation to have. And also, what my rabbi has done is also open. You might actually have seen God or felt God and not put that word to it. But let's talk about what that might be for you or not.
I've also been thinking so much, by the way, that God is not sort of the central part of the conversation. Somehow the Book of Separation is being very widely read by people who've left the Mormon world. And it's sort of been this fascinating experience of getting lots of emails from people in that world and doing this podcast. And their God, they sort of talk about, do I believe? What is my faith? And that is not the central question. It's, do I observe? And so that, I almost feel this embarrassment of like, oh God, it's such an awkward subject. The sense that we're not, even when I was Orthodox, that sense that, if you talked about God, you were like a little crunchy, a little out there. It wasn't at the centerpiece, it was observance. And I agree with you that to put, whether you attach belief or not, that larger question, that big sense of meaning and purpose, and why are we doing this?
Some of us just go to the oneg because the food is good.
Oh, thank you for a great talk. As I was listening to this issue of separation, I was thinking what I heard from the late Elie Wiesel, that the essence of a community is to be able to particularize universal themes. So those themes of separation, which you were talking about, and alternative growth, were the very themes I noticed when I was at the opera last couple nights ago watching Wagner's Die Walküre, where you have this separation between Brunhild and Wotan in terms of a different growth pattern that God saw for his Valkyrite daughter. But this is the same theme from Wagner that you're talking about in the Jewish tradition too. So I just wondered what comment you might have about the Wagnerian overtones in your conversation.
I'm happy to have that added into my way of thinking of it. Well, I think with memoir, on one hand, it's this deeply personal story. It's I did this, and then I thought this, and this. But in order for it to be interesting, of course, it has to go after the universal themes. And I thought in so many ways about the idea of separation. The title of the book, I'm usually terrible with titles. I come up with them way late in the game. But once, very early on, I learned that the biblical term for a get, the Jewish divorce document, is sefer kritut, a book of rending or tearing, or loosely translated, I translate as a book of separation. And that sense that we are always making separations. We are, in my case, it might be a separation from this particular world, but I think living is the process of crafting separation from earlier parts of ourselves, from communal notions of who we're supposed to be, of even the think about the primary family relationship, separating from parental roles, from child roles towards being a parent, towards separating. And I think when I was writing the book, I just kept coming back into that word for me. I think about any word that sort of pushed me through the book, it was this idea of separating. And that sense of tearing apart our own selves, and even writing the book is another way of separating from my own sense of the private experience, from my sense of the lived experience versus the written experience. But I come back to that word again and again because I think that to live is to separate. It's to separate from ourselves and to separate. I think maybe for all the book is about a marriage and a religion. I think probably the central separation is from a fixed notion of who we think we are to who we might become, and a fixed sense of living according to an external map or voice towards strengthening and crafting that internal voice and bolstering that. So I appreciate your pulling out that word very much.
I have a sort of a thought, it's not like in complete formation, but there's this idea in Judaism where there are all these rules, more than the 613. I mean, there are many, many more rules and norms, but that if you get too close to the source, you could burn yourself. Sort of like Moses couldn't get too close. I mean, the face can't get too close to that scary, raw power or spirituality that Judaism has put all these fences around to, I don't know if it's to protect us from that raw power, or that people could go crazy. They say you should, not look, go forward, but not delve too much into these spiritual arts because there could be a madness that results. So I think sometimes Judaism wants to go for the rules, like is your elbow covered and are your knees covered, your ankles or whatever, but is the mechitza high enough or low enough now, instead of wanting to delve into these issues of the spirituality or the warm feeling or understanding what all of that is. I don't know, there's a little bit of a danger spot is what I'm pointing. Do you find any of that in your search for spirituality?
Well, it's interesting. There's a motif throughout Jewish texts and Jewish of not looking. I think so much. One of my probably foundational childhood memories is being the little girl in the holiday service where you aren't supposed to look at the Kohanim, the priests, as they bless the congregation. And that sense that, I remember as a child, that urge to peek, and yet that sense that you're not supposed to. And that, I think that's a tension in Jewish life. I think about that idea, you can't see the face of God, or where you don't look and where you do look. And it's an interesting one to sort of parse that question of when do we face something head on and where do we look at it through layers or shielded. And I think there's so many places that sense of layers or veils around that sense of truth. I think what I would say maybe in response to that is, I think the danger in holding up the idea of not looking is it prevents you from seeing, sort of essentially, it prevents you from seeing the thing that maybe you need to see. And so, I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but my sense is the idea that we can't look too closely and we have to observe requires you to believe without knowing if you actually believe. And it goes at odds with that question of investigation and being willing to push closer. And when I think about my writer self knows that whenever I have that, I hear that writer voice all the time, that inhibited writer voice that says, don't get too close to that, don't go there. And that's always the writer voice I have to push past, that sense that you unpeel something, you pull off layer after layer after layer in writing, because there's the urge to name it and to touch it, which is, so I think that is a tension in terms of maybe religious life and the writing life, and where I think that ultimately you have to see as a writer, you have to be willing to look.
And I would just add, to pick up on the rules part of it, the 613 and more. One of the things I found in looking at each holiday was how many things have changed, have been reinvented all the way along. And things that are now strict and absolute were completely not. You take, for instance, Simchat Torah, right? When we mark the ending of the Torah cycle, well, that became a celebration because rabbis decided when we went from the 3-year cycle to the one, that there should probably be kind of a party, right? There should be some kind of acknowledgement that we finished the cycle. Whereas before, there wasn't sort of a demarcation so much because it was over 3 years. So trying to ask the rabbis and get to when did that change and realizing that that's just the way it's done now. And similarly, Hanukkah, where I had so many Orthodox rabbis say that Hanukkah is a warning, Abby. Hanukkah is an example of what can happen when we assimilate, when we water down our Judaism. The Maccabees were essentially the ultra-Orthodox of their day, preventing us from losing our difference. And we have to watch that now because, as they said to me, this is happening all over the place. People are watering down their Judaism, and quote unquote, this is a quote, Judaism isn't anything you want it to be. That was what was said to me. And then I had another rabbi say, Abby, Hanukkah is an invention. It was because they didn't get to celebrate Sukkot because Jewish practice had been outlawed by Antiochus in 167, I can't remember that year. And here they were making up for the fact that they had to skip Sukkot. That's why Hanukkah's 8 days. So the idea that that's part of the brilliance of Judaism is that it's adapted and it's changed. And sometimes I think this idea of what is fixed and what is not fixed is not just hurting us, but is actually inaccurate and wrong and making people feel like something is more codified and in a way stuck than it actually is or ever has been.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I'm going to use my prerogative to let my husband ask it. Well, forgive me. He's sitting here in the front row.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm Claire's husband. I'm the director of the Hillel here at Northwestern. And one other quick note as a side, the woman who asked about at the Oneg, so we have a 3-year-old who is trying to figure out if God is 1 or 2. So I wish the woman at the Oneg who doesn't believe, the two of them could get together and maybe help him figure things out. Thank you so much, both of you, and it was really special. The work I have the privilege of doing here is working with young people and trying to help them to consider or to kind of move along on their journey of what does it mean to be Jewish and figuring out how that connects with who they are as human beings. And I think listening to both of you, I'm hearing a lot about your journeys, and I know, Abby, I know a bit better, and I know the work that you did in the book. And I'm thinking from both your perspectives, and maybe particularly Abby, there's a lot of nuggets here of what you learned along the way. Do you think of what you did as a how-to book to some extent for young people or for really anyone as they're going along their journeys? And then Tova, if you'd like to answer, it's a very particular, it's your story, but also in the way that you've told your story, reflected on it, and then enable, I think, others to enter into telling and thinking about it, reflecting on their own experiences. So maybe if both of you could talk about the aspects of your works as, in a way, how-to books for us.
Someone jokingly said, is this a how-to book about how to leave a husband and a religion? Don't worry. Memoir can't be that. There's no sense of the instructive. This is what you should do. I think, someone said to me, what does your book teach? And, I think that question of, I don't feel like it has like a, you should do this or do that. I think that you can never map someone else's path through their own life. Any book, I think what a book can offer you is that question of what does it mean if you come to feel that you are not living authentically or that you're not living who you actually want to be, or if you live consumed by fear. And you mentioned the mass pike, part of the book sort of traces this into fear. What happens when fear prevents change or prevents action? And maybe the how-to in the book is the sense of, on one hand, of saying that you're not the only one, that these questions are ones so many people feel. And I just think about the past month or two since the book has come out, the number of emails I've received from people just saying, like, me too, whether it's someone who is part of an Orthodox community and says, I question, or I struggle, I am in this world, but I struggle, or someone who says, I live in the shadows, I'm not really, and I want to be, or someone who says, I left it, and it's lonely, and it's hard, or it's wonderful for me. The how-to maybe in memoir, I think, is less about a step-by-step what to do, but an expansion of the possibility of feeling and making space for stories that don't adhere. I often feel a frustration when people say, why would you tell this story publicly? This is the kind of thing we should tuck away, like, oh, I'm so sorry, But I feel that there's this sanctioned version, right, of how it's supposed to look. And part of writing memoir, I think really the endeavor of first-person writing and personal essays and memoir is to complicate that official version and to say that each of our lives are so much more complicated and that it doesn't look like that vision. And I think memoir, if anything, offers that space to say, this is my own story inside your story, and they overlap, and that they don't have to adhere to the version that maybe other people want to present as the public version of it.
I would say first that Michael, I have to, full disclosure, is in my book. A wonderful interview in the Yom HaZikaron chapter, which I'm very grateful for, and is really an indelible story. And he's also responsible for my son's Judaism now, so I hope that, right, as the director of Hillel. I think that one of the things we don't call out is the anxiety of ignorance that many young people feel and even adults feel about, that ship has sailed, I didn't get this, or it didn't interest me, or I didn't grow up with it, and it's kind of like, it's too much to take on. And I hope that this book maybe makes someone rethink that decision and say, let me open this back up a little bit and just see if there might be something here that's rich, that speaks to me, that matters, because I do think we have to be honest about the fact that for all the anxiety about Jewish continuity, if this stuff doesn't speak to you in whatever way, people are not going to continue it. Can't just be obligation. It can't just be inheritance, and it can't just be guilt. I really believe that. There has to be some discovery that makes someone choose it for themselves. And I hope this book doesn't overwhelm, but instead says, something you thought you had decided, or you thought your Judaism is baked, maybe just open this up a little bit. And also see how many voices there are that open this up for us. This is just Abby. I am your kind of your ambassador, taking you through an amazing, I think, laboratory that I was lucky enough to create for myself with all of these teachers. And I was an honest traveler, but everyone is. And sometimes I think people, either they don't love their rabbi, or I'm sure they love their Hillel director, but if they haven't been inspired, they leave the whole thing. And I would just say, maybe they leave room to be inspired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Both authors will be out in the fall. There are books for sale, and